To begin by always thinking of love as an action rather than a feeling is one way in which using the word in this manner automatically assumes accountability and responsibility. Bell Hooks. Bending, Not Breaking. The Gifts of Imperfection Edition. Episode 2. Love, Belonging, and the Things That Get in the Way. Welcome back to Bending, Not Breaking, the Gifts of Imperfection Edition. This is Ben Pruitt, your host for this mini-series, and this is our second episode of the Brene Brown's Gifts of Imperfection deep dive, and I'm really excited that we're doing this. It's working out so far. We're getting some feedback that it was a really great first episode for content-wise, and here we are. We're on episode 2. So we are reading this book in sections and discussing how moments of the Avatar universe align and brush up against the learnings from this book. And again, just to reiterate for everybody that my hope is that you will not have to read or buy the book in order to enjoy the content of these episodes. But I do think it would enrich the experience as it is the source material for our content for a few weeks. So if you do intend to purchase the book, just remember that your local bookstores appreciate the sales way more than corporations do, and an even better option would be to find a local bookstore owned by a Black or Indigenous or a person of color and support that way as well. All right, here we are. So we're, again, I guess it's just worth reminding us that we're still playing with the format of these episodes, so they'll change and adapt as we move through them, but of course, as mentioned before in episode 1 of this mini-series, one goal is I want to make sure you have the page numbers and or chapters that we are working on so that we can be all on the same page, both literally and figuratively. So this week, our intention is to engage with everything through the 3rd chapter in the book, which in the 10th anniversary edition is page 65. And then next week, we will read through the next chapter, which is we're going to start doing one guidepost at a time. So we're going to do guidepost 1 next week, and I'm really excited about that as well. And finally, before we kind of get to the legit content, if you are enjoying these episodes, just a reminder that we are offering a Patreon exclusive opportunity for people who may want to work on their, wholehearted journey. And you can meet with me one-on-one once a month, in which we will engage with the Avatar universe. Or if you prefer a different fictional universe, we can definitely do that instead. But what we'll do is we'll kind of work on your goals for cultivating more wholeheartedness using this as a template in this guide and the fictional universe of your choice. And so my goal is to kind of just walk with you and accompany you on your personal growth and development journey. And I hope that if that's something you're interested in, you ask about it. And if you're interested in more information, you can feel free to email me directly at thearkofe@gmail.com. Also, just like there are other cool perks that are available on Patreon. We do a monthly live episode. We have a lot of mini episodes that we will put out every now and then for patrons. And we just hope that you are checking that out. BNB_pod. And that brings us to the beginning of our content. And so this is going to be really exciting, and because there's a lot of conversations that are happening in this context. There's just like, oh my goodness, there's so much to tackle and so many ways that Avatar plays into it. And so I'm just really excited to kind of dive in. The first thing that Brene talks about in this second chapter is worthiness, and how really it's so interesting to me that the only thing that separates, in the research, I guess, the only thing that separates people from a deep sense of love and belonging, those who feel that way, I I am loved, I belong. And those that did not believe that, people don't love me, or I'm unlovable, or I don't belong here. The only thing that separated them was not believing that they were worthy. It's a sense of worthiness is the only thing that separates us. And that's just, wow, that's so unreal to me, because I think about all the characters that really struggle. I think about, Korra feeling like she's unworthy of being the Avatar when she loses her powers and she loses her bending abilities. I think about Zuko pretty consistently feeling unworthy, and therefore like he doesn't belong in the Fire Nation unless he's regained his honor. And it's just, there's so many different ways in which worthiness plays a role. And it comes into effect with body image, with Toph and Katara, who talk about body image in that episode in which Toph tries on makeup and they go to do the spa day. And there's just so many times where worthiness comes up. And the quote that really stood out to me, or one of, I guess, is, if we want to fully experience love and belonging, we must believe that we are worthy of love and belonging. And that's just kind of the synopsis of the whole thing. And I guess the problem is we spend our lives really just trying to distance ourselves from the things that we feel icky about in our lives, right? We spend so much time trying to distance from that memory of when someone called us X, Y, or Z, or where we felt like we were not enough. We try to avoid that thing as much as possible. And we just try to ostracize and get rid of the things that are a part of us that don't fit with who we think we're supposed to be, as opposed to who we really are, and just embracing our true selves, right? And we kind of stand, if we have our story that is holistic and whole, we stand outside of it, and we hustle for our worthiness by constantly performing and perfecting and pleasing and proving. And this is evident from episode 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where Zuko is training and he is like, I must perfect all of these forms. You will teach me the next one. And, Iroh is not in a hurry, because he knows that Zuko's worthiness is not hinging on this next firebending stance. But Zuko is in a hurry, because he needs to be perfect in order to fit in and please his father, in order to attempt to belong. He is trying to fit in. And that's just a tough example. Let's listen to it.
Drill it again!
The sages tell us that the Avatar is the last airbender. He must be over 100 years old by now. He's had a century to master the 4 elements. I'll need more than basic firebending to defeat him. You will teach me the advanced set!
Zuko. It really just kind of reminds me again of this concept of scarcity that we talked about last episode, where, if we feel like there's not enough time, or there's not enough anything, what we do is we end up acting from a place of scarcity rather than from a place of abundance, and that forces us into corners, and nobody likes to make decisions when we're first forced into a corner. So yeah, again, this just really reminds me of this moment. So the irony, I guess, of this is our source for worthiness is derived from our story, right? It's our worthiness hinges on the good, the bad, and the ugly pieces of our story, right? They become a part of us, and if we embrace them, what happens is there's this inner belonging where we end up belonging to ourselves, because we can embrace who we are. And that sounds like, oh, cool, lofty goal of I'm just gonna embrace who I am and love myself more. And I wish it were that easy. But we're gonna be talking about what gets in the way earlier. But man, it's not easy. So I think this kind of gets down to the comments on page 33 of the book, where there's just a list of the I'll be worthy when, and with a blank space, and then there's a list of comments where I'll be worthy when I graduate, I'll be worthy when I get a secure job, I'll be worthy when I get married, when I have children, when I lose weight, when I do X, Y, or Z. And I think the hinge of this whole conversation is we are worthy now. And it is not a matter of when or if. We are worthy as we are right now. The only thing that matters is whether we can believe it or not. And that's a big yikes. So, and I think what will happen is over the course of engaging with these 10 guideposts is we will begin to see the practices that help us cultivate that worthiness and cultivate a sense of understanding that we truly belong as we are, and that we are loved and lovable. Whew, these are heavy topics. Yikes. But that's going to bring us into love and belonging. And I really love, no pun intended, the definitions that she provides in this text. And I think that they're really helpful. So the meaning of love is really important to kind of dissect, and Brene Brown talks about this in her book. But like, we often are talking, we say I love you, we have conversations that include the word love, but we never really discuss what love actually means with the people we're using that word with. And when we're relying on a language such as English, in which there's so much fluidity between definitions, we have to seek clarity in order to understand how we might be talking about the same thing, but we have completely different ideas about what that thing is. And these conversations are really difficult because what that means is we're admitting that we don't quite know. We're admitting that we are uncertain. And yet, these things that we're discussing are things that we can't live without, that we would never choose to live without, right? I'm never going to say, I'm just going to have a loveless life. I don't need to belong anywhere. Like, we're neurobiologically wired to love and belong and connect with people. And so I think it's just imperative that we have this conversation. And so that's why I really just love these definitions. Which we'll get to in a second. But a key thing thinking about belonging is the difference between fitting in and belonging. And we've talked about this on the podcast in our long history. I'm almost certain of it. I don't know that I can point you to an episode, but the way it's described is when we try to fit in to a group, that is the primary barrier to us belonging in general. Because what we're doing is we are assessing a situation, and in order to discern what will help you feel like you can fit into the group, right? And you see this in school all the time where, there's the quote cool crowd, and then you see people who are trying to act like the cool crowd in order to be a part of it and feel like they can fit in. But it just creates a really toxic environment, and it's dangerous because what we're really after is belonging, right? And that is, it doesn't require us to change who we are. In fact, it's the opposite. It requires us to be who we are, regardless of whether some of our actions or the way we exist might rub other people the wrong way, right? It's about finding our people and our tribe, if you will, who can embrace who we are without having to make us change, right? While there are several examples of fitting in all of these series, in the comics and everywhere, one specific spot that I'm recalling is with Toph and her parents. And in season 2, or book 2, if you will, where Toph is, in the night and in her free time sneaking off to do these earthbending feats, and she's this champion and is hiding herself from her family, and she's acting fragile and, blind and incapable. And I guess she's not acting blind, she is blind. She is acting blind, right? She can see with her feet. She's pretending she can't, move through the world, but I guess she's leveraging the cultural expectations of how our abilities or lack thereof can affect our engagement with the world. And she does that so that she can fit into the expectations of her parents. And I'm just recalling this moment where she breaks that mold and decides to stand her ground. No pun intended.
Toph, there's too many of them. We need an earthbender. We need you.
My daughter is blind. She is blind and tiny and helpless and fragile. She cannot help you.
Yes, I can.
And then this girl goes in and takes down all of these earthbenders who are, professional fighters, and she just rips them all down and gets after it. And I think that when she does that, it is something that she is hoping against all hope that she will be accepted for who she is and what she has from her parents. And of course, we find out that her parents are not quite as accepting as we would hope, which is part of what makes this whole concept of love and belonging so vulnerable, is that the problem is that love and belonging will always be uncertain, right? Connection and relationship are, they are necessary and important in our lives, but we cannot measure that, right? Anyone who attempts to define it is doing the best they can to answer the unanswerable, right? We can't put our nose on it, and we can't measure it, and we can't know whether someone is going to love us back. We cannot know if we will belong in a specific situation by being who we are until we walk in to that situation, right? And man, that's tough, right? Love belongs in our lives, and belonging belongs in our lives. And I think what's important about that is that they are integral. And I think she talks about this in the book as well. Like, you can't really speak of one without the other. They're interwoven in this intentional knot where they may be separate strands, but they are connected in the same unit and tied together. And so ultimately, again, I think it's just worth realizing that if you think about all the people that you love in your lives, and think about whether you have control over whether they love you back. And the answer is we don't. And that's terrifying. But how beautiful is it that we can experience love and know that that's part of why it's so beautiful, is because often it is such a vulnerable thing that we experience. Okay. Oof. Wow. That's a lot. I think one of the things that's worth lifting up again from this book, and I think I've said it already, but we are biologically, cognitively, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of these wired to love and to be loved and to belong. And when these needs are not met, we don't function the way we're meant to. And again, I think about this especially poignant arc of Zuko, because it's not a redemption arc. It's a wholeheartedness arc. It's a journey to wholeheartedness. And when he isn't loved from his father, and when he isn't given this chance to belong, he doesn't function the way he's meant to, right? He instead tries to do, quote, villainous things. And when we act outside of our boundaries and our values and the things that we care about, we start to lose ourselves, and not being loved and not having a place to belong exacerbates that. And just the same as, being hungry or lonely or tired, all of those can help us act outside of our values as well. So ultimately, again, the absence of love and belonging, to put it to a point, always leads to suffering and hurt. So let's read these definitions together and discuss just a little bit about each of them. So let's read the definition for love, and again, you can find this on page 36 of your text. Love. We cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. Love is not something we give or get, it is something that we nurture and grow. A connection that can only be cultivated between two people when it exists within each one of them. We can only love our others as much as we love ourselves. Shame, blame, disrespect, betrayal, and the withholding of affection damage the roots from which love grows. Love can only survive these injuries if they are acknowledged, healed, and rare. And I think about that, like, do any of us really want this definition to be true? Because that's just terrifying. Like, do we want it to be true that we have to love ourselves in order to not limit how we love our children and our loved ones? I think that's terrifying, right? Like, loving our people, our tribe, the people that we care about, loving them is often easier than loving our imperfect selves, right? And I think the way it's described in one of her talks is, we can talk about if we're raising a child, we can tell our child that they are beautiful, that they are gorgeous, and when they are wearing their clothes, they don't need to worry about what other people think. But if we don't love ourselves, they're going to learn from the way we treat ourselves just as much, if not more than, the way we speak to them. So if they see me in the mirror talking about, man, my butt in these jeans just doesn't look good, and they're like, well, do you like those jeans? How do you feel about them? Because what other people think don't matter. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh no, they're watching me. They're thinking about what I'm doing. And the way we speak to ourselves and the way we interact and the way we engage with ourselves carries so much metaphorical weight in how we engage with love and belonging, and teaching love and belonging, and instilling love and belonging in the people that we love. It's the same deal if, our loved one drops milk on the ground and they're like, oh, I'm such an idiot. And you're like, no, sweetie, it's like when you make a mistake, you're not an idiot. You made a mistake. We all make mistakes, right? Instead, if you then drop milk on the ground or spill your coffee and you say, God, I'm such an idiot, they're going to learn that from you, and they're going to take that on, which is why we have to love ourselves in order to love others to the capacity that we would like. And so those are just a few examples. But in general, I think it's important that we realize that loving ourselves is hard. And in order to love others well, we have to love ourselves. And apparently this is a pretty controversial topic. And so I'm curious what you all are thinking about this. But I want to kind of pick apart what practicing self-love looks like. And there are several moments throughout this series where we see this, but it's trusting ourselves. It's treating ourselves with respect. It's being kind and affectionate towards ourselves. When we make mistakes, it's understanding that it's a mistake and not a matter of who we are. And frankly, this is a lot when we consider how often we speak to ourselves with such harsh language. Like, I am very, very bad at this. I wish I were better at it, but instead I'm practicing and I'm getting better, but it requires practice and work. And I have a theory about Cora here. So One of the things I really appreciate about Korra early on in book 1 of The Legend of Korra is that Korra is confident and has an innate sense of belonging. Like, she knows she belongs, right? And I think a lot about how and why people dislike The Legend of Korra, and I think this might be one of the reasons. I think that what we're seeing is we're seeing someone who they know they belong, and people are uncomfortable with seeing such a strong person emotionally, like where they are, and they belong here, and they know that when they do something right, that they shouldn't be punished, and they just are willing to stick up for themselves. And that kind of confidence rubs people the wrong way, because we are most judgmental of others in areas where we ourselves are lacking. And when other people are constantly questioning their sense of love and their sense of belonging in the world, when we see someone who comes into the world and like, nope, I belong, we perceive that to be cocky, and we perceive it to be overconfident and egotistical, and that's a lot of the critiques of Korra are this. And I wonder what it would be like if we kind of reframed the way we viewed Korra as someone who is, they know they belong, right? So here's a moment from episode 1 that I think is worth lifting up from book 1 of Korra.
You're in a whole mess of trouble, young lady.
But there were some thugs threatening a helpless shopkeeper, and I
Panicked. You should have called the police and stayed out of the way.
But I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. It's my duty to help people. See, I'm the Avatar.
Oh, I am well aware of who you are, and your Avatar title might impress some people, but not me.
All right, fine. Then I want to talk to whoever's in charge.
I mean, you gotta just love that spunk, right? It is so awesome to see a person that is so confident that they're willing to be like, fine, give me the next person who's in charge. I'm willing to talk about whoever, and like, just willing to stand up for themselves, because it's so nice to have that modeled for us, that we can have boundaries and we can know that we deserve what we deserve and we can ask for it, right? And so, I mean, there are obviously ways in which we should pay attention to how we're doing that, and I don't know that Korra is perfect in any sense of the word, but I do think that this is a neat way to reframe kind of her confidence as, no, she believes she's worthy. She believes that when she makes an action, she does it for the right reasons, and that's just a really powerful thing to consider. So I wonder if how you feel about my Korra theory. Do you feel like this is one of the reasons why people might find Korra to be not as, quote, not as good as Aang, among other reasons? But I'm curious. What are your thoughts? Okay. So again, just practicing self-love, difficult. Remember, we have to trust ourselves. We have to treat ourselves with respect, all that jazz. And I think that's just really integral and important to think about. So I want to kind of dive into the definition for belonging as well. So I'm going to read that now. So this is on page 37 of this 10th anniversary edition. Belonging is the innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and by seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. Because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. And I think that's really important, that last line, like, we have to accept ourselves in order to feel like we can belong anywhere else. Because if we never belong to ourselves, then how can we belong to anything else? And so that's why we have to, like, okay, if we need to love ourselves, we need to be able to accept ourselves. And if we need to be able to accept ourselves, we need to be able to love ourselves. It's back to this knot, right? Where they're tied together and they're necessary to interact with one another. Okay, so that brings us to this concept that oftentimes we will say things that we don't necessarily practice. We will profess values that we don't necessarily practice. And we have to practice what we preach, y'all. Like, love and action are integral to our success. And like, I think one of the things that Brene talks about is someone asked her if, like, can you love someone even though you have cheated on them? And a lot of people, like, the gut reaction will be, yes, you can love someone deeply and make a mistake, right? But I think the way that Brene kind of explains it is you can feel love towards people that have behaved poorly. You can feel love towards someone and act another way. But the people that I want to be in relationship with are the people that do both, right? I want someone who practices and professes, right? And I think what's integral about the definition of love is that when we have those acts of betrayal or neglecting each other, or withholding affection, or all of the things, shame, blame, etc., they have to be few, and they have to be acknowledged, and they have to be healed in order for love to continue. So can someone come back from a moment of, a betrayal, of cheating, for instance? And I think the answer is yes, but it requires the healing process. And oftentimes that's where we fail miserably, is not doing well in the healing process and the accountability. So we have to believe that love is an action, and we have to believe that that it is actionable. Otherwise, we can't be held accountable or responsible for our love. And I think that we have to believe that they are integral and tied together to action. So, again, what that kind of translates to is, in order to love ourselves, we have to practice loving ourselves. There needs to be actionable items we can do in order to love ourselves and therefore others, right? It's, I think one example that I heard of is it's like secondhand smoke and smoking. Like, I can love me all I want and smoke, but in order to love the people around me, when I smoke around them, that secondhand smoke is deadly, right? And so there's a lot of learning that we learned about secondhand smoke that it doesn't do damage, but it does. It does a lot of damage. And so I think it's just worth lifting up that it's not an either or, but a both and. We must love both ourselves and others in order to reach our full loving potential. So, man, now that we kind of have grappled with love and we've grappled with belonging, we totally get it, and now we understand it, and we are going to start doing it right away. And that's the end, so there's no point in going on. Ha 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 ha, I wish it were that easy. But unfortunately it's not. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the next chapter, and we're going to learn about the things that get in the way of love and belonging, and dissect those a little bit more so that we understand them. So Brene opens up this next chapter, chapter 3, the things that get in the way. She opens this up by telling the story of her worst speaking experience. And if you're interested in the audio version of Daring Greatly / The Gifts of Imperfection kind of mashed together and slightly abridged, I recommend listening to the Audible it's available on Audible and elsewhere, I think, but it's called The Power of Vulnerability. And it's kind of a mix between the two books. But one of the things I appreciate is she tells this story, and it's a little bit more vivid than the way she writes it in this book. But anyway, here's a quick synopsis. Anyway, this is the beginning of her first speaking experience that was to, quote, normal people, not, researchers or scientists. And she arrives at the event, she's excited, and she's greeted by this woman who looks her up and down, is clearly judging her clothing, and says, you don't look like a researcher, and then learns about what she studies and says, you study shame? Oh my goodness. And kind of has a breakdown and says, we can't talk about shame, people will be eating. And this is where Brene talks about how this is the first time she realized that talking about shame would make people barf, and that maybe there might be an association there. And anyway, this woman just kind of belittles her, makes her feel small, and then says, you will speak about this is what I thought you were going to speak about, and so you will do this. And because Brene was acting from a place of scarcity, and this is how she tells this story, she says that she agreed to do something that was outside of her values. And so she went up and gave this talk, and she didn't even talk about the things that she knew about. She was talking about, happy is good, and joy is good, and it is good to be joyful, and it is good to be happy. And she walked away from that experience feeling, slimed and small and sad. But the deal is, when we are hustling for our worthiness, we agree to things like what this woman asked Brene Brown to do, and then we feel ashamed later. And when we know we are worthy of love and belonging, we are more likely and better equipped to say no and have clearer boundaries. Because one of the things Brene talks about is that later on, right now, after having practiced this work, she would say absolutely not, and then walk out on this woman. But because she was coming from that hustle for worthiness, she agreed to do it. And I think that we've all had experiences like that, where we agree to things and then feel slimed and ashamed later, and we know that we should have said no. So I think another takeaway from that story is that the woman talking to Brene saying, no, people like how to be happy. Give them 5 steps. And I think the problem is that how to doesn't work. And evidence over a long period of time has shown that it doesn't work, because if it did, we would all have this down by now, right? If how to worked, we wouldn't have problems. We would be doing great. But unfortunately, it doesn't. So what that means is then, if we want to engage love and belonging, we cannot skip the hard conversations about what gets in the way. We can't only talk about happiness and joy. We have to talk about shame and guilt and humiliation and embarrassment and all of the things that prevent us from leaning into happiness and joy and vulnerability and love and belonging, etc. And I found it particularly funny that Brene Brown kind of described this as the hard stuff as the swampland of the soul, because you don't want to live there, but you do want to know how to wade through it safely, which for me is a really apt metaphor. But then I was thinking about the swamp benders and how they were all loving living in the swamp, and I was like, oh, maybe that's not an apt metaphor for everybody. But I do think for general rules, thinking about how we don't want to live in this marshy, swampy, muckiness. But we do, in order to live well, we need to know how to get through it when we're thrown in. So yeah, I think that's just worth lifting up. And one way I think about this is for how to, for example, is like, we all know how to eat healthfully. We know how to exercise. We often know how to do the things that we want to do in order to get better. But with all of this knowledge, we are still facing insurmountable crises of debt, addiction, mental and physical health, violence, loneliness, among other things, right? This is not the end of the list, right? But we as a culture are grappling with all of these things, even though as a culture we know how to eat healthfully, we know how to exercise. So like we don't talk about how we are too busy. We are so desperate to numb these negative feelings that we're experiencing. We're full of anxiety. We're constantly hustling for worthiness because it has become the norm. We are living in a culture in which it is normal to hustle for our worthiness, which is why I think, again, when I think about us in that frame of mind as a culture, it makes sense that people are struggling to enjoy Cora because we're so judgmental of her when she is able to sit there and lavish her worthiness and know that she belongs. I just think it's really beautiful because she's awesome and Cora's great. And you should watch more Cora. Like, we should all watch more Cora. Am I right? Or am I right? Okay. So this brings us to shame and shame tapes and what shame is. And so, again, Brene Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And that's terrifying because, y'all, there are these shame tapes that play in our head and described as like gremlins from, like, I think it's the 80s movie movie of the same title. But anyway, what's cool about gremlins is they kind of multiply in the dark, but when light hits them, they dissipate. And shame's the same way, right? And so let's talk about shame. And she says the Shame Resilience 101. First, we all have shame. Shame is universal. And it's one of the most primitive human emotions that we experience. And the only people who don't experience shame are people who are like psychopaths and sociopaths and people who are literally unable to experience other people's pain. And so shame is universal. And two, we are all afraid to talk about our own shame, right? It's universally there too. None of us want to talk about why we're ashamed of something. And then third, the less we talk about it, the more control it has. And that's why it's so scary. It puts us in a position where not only do we not want to talk about it, but it's going to grow and metastasize with the less we talk about it. So we must talk about it in order to resolve it. So it's important to realize that shame is in all the familiar places, which is why it comes up so often, I think, in the Avatar universe, right? It happens in our very familiar places. It happens in appearance and body image. That's the most popular shame trigger, I think. It happens in family, parenting, money and work, health, addiction, sex, aging, religion, all the things, right? Like, shame lives everywhere. And the deal is, when we have stories that we believe will disappoint people or push them away, it often results in shame. And there's a real fear that we can be buried or defined by an experience that in reality is only a sliver of who we really are, right? Like, I don't ever want to, I would never want to be defined by my worst experience. Oh my goodness, I have done so much in my life. I am 30 years old, and I think about how I could be defined by the one thing I did that ruined me. And I think about how we treat people who have been justice involved, and anyone who has experienced the justice system can, be convicted of a crime, and then all of a sudden that's the only thing that people associate with them for the rest of their lives. They can't get work, they can't do X, Y, or Z because they're constantly being judged by the worst thing they ever did. And I think that that's something that is problematic about our system. And I mean, there's a lot of really cool nonprofits that help people find work that had been just as involved. And so anyway, I wanted to lift that up, and I would hope that people wouldn't judge me by my worst thing that I ever did. So I'm going to do my best to not judge people by their worst actions, right? We can be more than one experience. We are all more than one experience. But shame tells us the opposite. Shame tells us that we are going to be defined by that one experience. And so we have to hide it and feel shame for it, right? So I want to kind of lift up this idea that we all have capacity for shame resilience, and we all have this ability, right? We have the ability to recognize it, move through it constructively, and ultimately, when shame happens, we can develop more courage, compassion, and connection as a result of the experience. But here's the deal. The less we talk about it, the less resilient we are, right? That's important. And the second part is it happens between people. Like, shame is it happens between people. It's not just an internal thing. It's based off other people. And therefore, the healing for that also requires other people. Or to put it another way, a social wound requires a social balm. And so the research shows that shame-resilient people have an understanding of shame. They can recognize what messages trigger shame. They can understand and name it, right? The second thing is they practice critical awareness by reality checking expectations and messages. The third is they reach out, share stories with people they trust. Fourth, they speak shame. They literally use the word shame and talk about how they're feeling and ask for what they need. And that's terrifying, right? It's so much. But here's the deal. We have moments where Zuko does this, right? The moment of his healing, he says, I was so ashamed. And then Iroh is like, I love you anyway, right? He is able to name it, and that's where he's most resilient. It's at the end of the series. And it takes him a long time to cultivate that sense of worthiness and belonging and love. And he took the whole arc to get there. But listen, this is why it's a wholeheartedness journey, not a redemption arc. It's because he's always had this. He was a loving child. He cared about turtle ducks. He was a loving child. And then he had this traumatic incident with his father. And that took it away from him. And it forced him to act outside of his values in order to hustle for worthiness. And so shame was the driver there. And that is what makes shame so drastic, because this whole series wouldn't happen without this traumatic incident. And it's so sad. Oof. Okay. Let's separate the difference between shame and guilt, shall we? So in the book, we articulate shame is, to put it in layman's terms, I am bad, whereas guilt is I did something bad. So shame is self-directed and guilt is behavior-directed. And I think it's important to note that a lot of people believe that shame is a really important and necessary tool for behavioral change. And there's a real problem with that, because yes, it is the most powerful tool for behavioral change. But what happens when we use shame is we forget or ignore the means by which the change occurs, which the means are its destruction of self, its creation of conditional belonging, and it creates lasting intra and interpersonal wounds. And that's a quote from Hillary McBride, who is one of my favorite clinicians out there in the world. And so I think when you think about shame and how it changes behavior, it's also worth noting that shame is highly correlated with violence, aggression, depression, addiction, eating disorders, bullying. And again, I'm reminded of this moment at the beach where all these firebending children, or I guess the Fire Nation teens, are around this campfire, and Azula is talking about what her mother said. And here's that quote for you.
Well, those were wonderful performances, everyone.
I guess you wouldn't understand, would you, Azula? Because you're just so perfect.
Well, yes, I guess you're right. I don't have sob stories like all of you. I could sit here and complain how our mom liked Zuko more than me, but I don't really care. My own mother thought I was a monster. She was right, of course, but it still hurt.
This moment is so... It's so quick, because right after this, Ty Lee just comes in and says, and we're all happy again. And like, no, y'all, like, let's acknowledge this moment with Azula. Let's talk to her about it. This is our chance. And we missed it. But when she says she was right, when she says that her mother was right, that, y'all, that is shame. That is shame speaking. And it's highly correlated with violence, aggression, depression, addiction, eating disorders, bullying, and like, hello, Azula, violence, aggression, bullying, like all of these things are real for her. And we see her do those things throughout the whole series. We see her bully Ty Lee and May. We see her aggressive. We see, oh my goodness. So I'm just saying, shame is a very powerful tool for behavioral change, but the problem with that is shame corrodes the part of ourselves that believes that we can change and do better. Guilt encourages positive change. Shame corrodes like the core of who we are, even though we may change. So I think it's just worth noting that shame as a behavioral tool is not okay. All right, there's a lot more that goes on in this chapter, and the last one I want to talk about is moving away, moving towards, and moving against, because this is a really crucial moment and crucial learning, right? So moving away is when someone says something that's shaming and you respond by withdrawal or hiding or silencing yourselves or keeping secrets. And so someone says something to you and you're like, okay. And then you like retreat and you run away. Moving towards someone when they say something that's shaming. For instance, if someone were critiquing the way that I were raising my children and I had to go away on a business trip and they responded to me like, well, I'm so glad that you have people that are able to take care of your kids for you. And I'd be like, moving towards would be, I wish I was as good as you. I wish I could take care of my kids every day like you do. And it's just people pleasing, and it's really ugh. And then you want to throw up in your mouth a little bit when you anyway. But yeah, that's what moving towards is it's appeasing the people and making them feel better about themselves. Moving against is trying to gain power over others. It's being aggressive and it's using shame to fight shame. So if someone's making me feel bad about the way that I'm raising my kids, I'm going to, poke back at the way that they raise their kids. Well, I'm going to be like, well, have you seen your kids at school? Man, maybe they need somebody else to be raising them. And so it's, using shame to fight shame, being aggressive about it. And I think what we are looking for is, how do we stand our sacred ground when we are in that shaming moment? It's don't shrink, don't puff up, stand your sacred ground. And so rather than, I'm not going to run away, I'm not going to, appease or please you, I'm not going to, run against you. I'm just going to stand where I am and belong and know that I'm worthy and that I made the best decision I could in this moment. And we'll talk more about that as the days go on and as the episodes go on. But here we are. This has been a longer episode. There's a lot going on. There's a lot more we could have talked about. I can't talk about everything, but it is what it is. So if you are enjoying these episodes and you want to leave a comment or a review on one of the wherever you stream, that would be super helpful. Or if you want to engage more about the episodes, you can find us on all of the Insta media handle thingies. So BNB_pod is our handle. You can send us an email, and if you prefer to engage via voice memo, you can do that and send us the voice memo there at thearkofe@gmail.com. But I guess that's close to the end there. So thank you for being here. Next time, again, reminder that we're going to dive into the first guidepost, so guidepost 1. And we're glad that you're joining us on this journey. And if you have an idea for a cool segment, tweet at us, Instagram us, DM us, all the things. Feel free to join our Facebook group, and we'll talk about the episodes and talk about the world of Avatar. Thank you to Brene Brown for offering us this text, for Alex Mayfield, Noah Blanchard, Max Gongware, and until next time, be well and do